Hello, my name is Bradley Supernaw. I'm an attorney in Nebraska, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the Nebraska inheritance tax and how it works. As usual, this video is intended for informational purposes only and not as legal advice. Every case, every situation is a little bit different, so the laws will apply a little bit different. Also, if you are outside of Nebraska, different states have different laws, so these laws may not apply to your state. In fact, not all states have inheritance tax. Some have a state tax, some don't have any type of post-death tax at all. Also in this video, I'm not here to give any political opinions about whether the inheritance tax or estate tax is a good idea or not, whether it's useful or not. This is just laying out how the inheritance tax works in Nebraska. I'm also not going to talk about the federal estate tax. The federal estate tax exemption is so high that very few estates are actually subject to the federal estate tax. I'm not sure what it is right now. The last time I looked, it was well over $10 million, and there just aren't that many estates that have a value over $10 million. In Nebraska, the property that is subject to the inheritance tax is anything that passes by will or by the intestate laws of the state. Intestate is a legal term that means somebody died without a will. You might have heard the term last will and testament. So when somebody dies with the will, it's called a testate estate because there was a last will and testament. If they don't have a will, it's called an intestate estate. And each state has laws that deal with how to distribute property so that it doesn't just sit there with no owner. There is one main exception to the inheritance tax. That is life insurance proceeds that go to someone other than the estate. If it passes through the estate, then it is taxed. If it goes to a named beneficiary, one or more named beneficiaries, then it is not taxed. The statute is drawn such that it will sweep in a lot of property owned by the deceased. It will include any transfer made in contemplation of death or any transfer intended to take effect on the date of death. This includes things like a joint tenancy with the right of survivorship on land. It includes things like a revocable living trust, any property in the trust that is distributed upon the death of the grantor of the trust, or includes any bank accounts or investment accounts that are payable on death. In order to be subject to the Nebraska inheritance tax, the deceased must be a resident of Nebraska, or if you're dealing with real property, the real property has to be located within Nebraska. So I've handled, for example, a situation where, and it's fairly common in Nebraska, somebody grows up on a farm, they move out, have their career elsewhere, and then their parents pass away, leaving farmland to them and their siblings. And then they may own that until they pass away, and then it goes to their children, for example. And even though when that person passed away, they didn't live in the state of Nebraska, since the real estate is located in Nebraska, it'll still be subject to the Nebraska inheritance tax. The difference between an estate tax like the federal estate tax and an inheritance tax like what Nebraska has is that the estate tax is a tax on the estate. An inheritance tax technically is a tax on the people who receive the inheritance. In practice, however, the estate, if it has enough funds, will pay the inheritance tax on behalf of the distributees or the beneficiaries of the estate. Like the federal estate tax, there are deductions when calculating the state inheritance tax. Unlike the federal estate tax, which has deduction for the entire estate, the deductions for the Nebraska inheritance tax depends upon the relation between the beneficiary and the deceased. The Nebraska deductions changed on January 1st, 2023. And as of the time that I recorded this video, that's been long enough ago that you don't see too many inheritance tax calculations anymore for somebody who passed away before January 1st, 2023. But there was a change on January 1st, 2023, and so the numbers I'm giving deal with the inheritance tax after that date for somebody who passed away after that date. For each of these categories, there is no tax for somebody who is under the age of 22 years. So the first is the spouse of the deceased. There is no tax on anything that the spouse receives. So if the spouse gets everything from the deceased, then there is no inheritance tax. For immediate family members and lineal descendants of the deceased, there's a $100,000 deduction. That's $100,000 per beneficiary, not total. Immediate family includes parents of the deceased, brothers and sisters of the deceased, children, grandchildren, other lineal descendants of the deceased. It does not include nieces and nephews, that's a different category, or aunts and uncles, again, that's a different category. The immediate family does include any spouse of someone who is in this category. So a brother-in-law or sister-in-law, a step-parent, daughter-in-law or son-in-law, those count as immediate family. And of course, it also includes people who were adopted into that relationship. For example, if you have an adopted child, that counts as a lineal descendant. The next category are remote relatives. Those are your aunts and uncles, cousins, and further out, and any lineal descendants of aunts and uncles and cousins. The deduction for the remote family is $40,000 per person. The final category is anybody else who receives. For that final category, the deduction is $25,000 per person. So the way the deduction works is that anything that person receives above the deduction amount is taxed at a certain rate. Kind of like your income tax, where you have your deductions, anything above that is taxed at a certain rate. The amount that's taxed also depends upon which category the beneficiary is a part of. So for example, again, the spouse, there's no tax, so there's no tax rate. For the immediate family, anything above that $100,000 deduction is taxed at a 1% rate. So if you received a farm from your dad or your mom and the value of the farm is $500,000, you deduct the $100,000 from that, so you have a $400,000 asset that you've inherited. The tax rate on the $400,000 is 1%, so you'd pay a $4,000 inheritance tax. For remote relatives, the tax rate is 11%, and the same thing applies. Anything that the person receives above the $40,000 deduction is taxed at 11% rate. So if you receive that same $500,000 farm from your uncle or aunt instead of your parents, then the $500,000 minus the $40,000 deduction, that's $460,000, and you're taxed at 11% of that, which would be a little over $50,000. Finally, for the everybody else category, you have a tax rate of 15% tax rate. So anything above the $25,000 deduction is taxed at a 15% rate. So using that same farm example, if you inherited it from your friend instead of your aunt and uncle or your parents, then you would have the $500,000 minus the $25,000 deduction. So the $475,000 would be subject to the inheritance tax, and it would be taxed at a 15% rate. So the tax on that $475,000 would be a little over $71,000. So you can kind of see the difference on the same inheritance. It makes a big difference whether you're immediate family, distant relative, or anybody else. So the unit of government that receives the proceeds from the inheritance tax is the county. It's either the county where the deceased lived when they passed away, or in case of real estate, the county where the real estate is located. In the first half of 2023, the total inheritance tax collected by all counties in Nebraska was only a little under $45 million. The highest amount, of course, was at Douglas County. That's no surprise. It's Nebraska's most populated county. Douglas County collected in that first half of 2023 about $11.5 million. The low end of the spectrum was Banner County out in the Panhandle, which only collected $790. There was also one county that didn't report any inheritance tax, and I don't know if that's because they didn't collect any during that first half of 2023 or if they just hadn't reported it yet when the report was compiled. Also, not all inheritance tax is paid by Nebraska residents. Again, since it applies to estates of deceased who lived in Nebraska or to real estate in Nebraska, about $11 million was paid by a little over 2,000 non-residents. So that's about 25% of the inheritance tax during that period paid by people who live outside the state of Nebraska. So to calculate the inheritance tax, the total assets of the estate are calculated. Then certain deductions are made from that calculation. The estate's expenses, for example, funeral costs, attorney's fees. If the personal representative charges a fee, then the personal representative's fee. Once all those deductions are taken, you have the net value of the estate. Once you have the net value of the estate, each beneficiary's portion of that is calculated, and then you apply the inheritance tax deduction and then calculate the tax from that. So that's the Nebraska inheritance tax in a nutshell. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you found it informative, and until next time.